Good evening and welcome to the forum. I'm John Matisonn. Tonight we're going to be talking about climate change with the big international conference going on in Glasgow. My first guest is Happy Khambule. Happy, welcome.
Thank you for having me, and hello to all the viewers.
Happy, so this is the big moment we've all been waiting for. Just to introduce you again, you're a senior political advisor at Greenpeace Africa. You wear a lot of other hats. You're chairman of the Clean Cities South Africa and various other things which we'll come to. And you're also have been a delegate drafting the United Nations targets for South Africa. I want to get straight into COP26, which started today. It's been long awaited, but the signs aren't good. The Chinese president and the Russian president have not shown up. The Australian government's targets are considered pretty weak. American President Joe Biden is there, but he's been weakened. He wants to play a strong role on climate change, but he's failed to get his legislation on climate change through the Senate. And the British Prime Minister, who's the host, he's been criticized for having started late and not done a good enough job. It all seems to be symbolized by the fact that Queen Elizabeth herself, who really wanted to be there, but she hasn't been well, is not there herself.
Yeah. We're in a very tight situation in terms of just like the political dynamics that are concerning the actual negotiations. But I mean, that's where the world is right now. We're coming from a pandemic. We just came from a huge global economic downturn, and then there's also been supply chain constraints. There's microchip shortages. But at the point where we're at is that people are trying their best to actually move the conversation forward. And when you refer to something like what China and Russia are doing, is the presidents might not be there, but they are sending some of their highest delegation or delegates to the actual negotiation. So we're looking forward to see what they will put forward.
Right. All right, let's start very briefly at the beginning. What does the science tell us is the problem? I know that there's a new United Nations report, and the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said this latest report is a thundering wake-up call.
Yeah. I mean, what the science is really telling us is that what we are putting forward to address climate change is not enough. It's simply nowhere near what we need to do. If we want to reach 1.5 at least, or rather at most 1.5 by the turn of the century, we're going to have to do much more. So right now, with everything put together, we're moving towards 2.7 degrees.
So just to be clear, 1.5 degrees above what we were before the Industrial Revolution is the limit we want to set for us not to do much further damage to the climate and the damage that ensues.
And that's a global average, which is very different when you contextualize it to different regions. So for sub-Saharan Africa, we're talking 1.5 is about 3.2 degrees to 3 degrees. So it's more or less a doubling effect when you consider different geographical areas.
So that means we in sub-Saharan Africa, we are twice as badly affected as the average of the rest of the world.
Correct. Yeah.
And let's just talk about the goals. There's a goal that people talk about of 2030 and a goal for 2050. Can you just explain what those are?
Okay, so the goal for 2030 is really one of those milestones that have been set by, not only countries in terms of the political impetus in order to show that you're doing something on climate change, but also it is one of those milestones that scientists are using in order to convene people around a particular milestone. So the 2050 milestone as well, which is more or less half the century, is along the lines of what we're supposed to prepare, and every country is supposed to prepare what we call call long-term, low emission strategies, which basically talk about if we get to 2050, what is it going to look like in your country? And 2030 just helps the process of being able to develop that. What has actually happened is that because every 5 years we're supposed to be preparing our commitments in how we're going to be addressing climate change, which tries to synchronize with our elections, our different political systems. Most countries have put forward something along the lines of 2030, but in our case, as South Africa, we've got a 5-year commitment, which is up to 2025, and then up to 2030, we've got another 5-year process. So we're trying our best, at least in some cases, to have 5-year timeframes, but most countries have something along the lines of 2030 because of what science has been able to get people to coalesce around. But there's also the impetus, which is a more political agenda from the COP negotiations to have something along the lines for 2050.
Now, the general international targets for 2050 are basically to get to zero new carbon emissions. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct. Is that the for us to keep ourselves at least below 2 degrees, yes, most of the world must move to carbon neutrality by 2050. And in some cases, obviously, it would necessitate some countries to still emit some emissions, but some countries, like developed countries, have to be net zero. So they have to be negative zero emissions.
Right. And the target for 2030?
So the target for 2030 differs, but more, the average should be at least 60% carbon emissions.
Of 60% of what we have been in the last few years.
For pre-industrial levels, right? Before pre-industrial levels. But in terms of for South Africa, what we've put forward is pretty different, obviously, as a developing country. So we've got some leeway in order to still maintain some form of carbon output whilst we build our adaptive capability, as well as changing our energy and food systems to be less carbon intensive.
Now, before we get to some specifics and to South Africa in particular, tell me if my general sense is just a prejudice or if I'm right. When I look at the targets for 2050, world leaders seem to be more sweeping in their promises for 2050, which is a point in which most of them will no longer be in power. So it's easy for them to say that. Am I right?
You are correct. You're totally correct. And that's the big fight right now, is that we're hearing so many good things about what's going to happen in 2050, but half of the people will not be there. Even on top of that is we don't even see how we're going to get there, right?
Right. So they're not really realistic.
No, in many cases they're not. No. And that's the aim, is that in the period between now and 2030 and 2035, we need to start to see those 5-year commitments and plans showing a trajectory that's going to reach that 2050 target.
And the 2030 targets, how realistic are they? Are people going to meet them? Is the world going to meet them?
So the conflict here is really that the 2030 targets are not as ambitious as they need to be. People are under committing, right? We know that people can do more, but they're not actually committing at the level that they need to. But when they talk about 2050, they're doing something really, really outrageous. So there's a bit of a conflict there. But for 2030, it's not looking good in terms of when we put together all the commitments together.
Right. Okay. Let's move on to look at South Africa. The argument of the South African government. I listened to the Minister of Forestry and the Environment, Fisheries and the Environment, Barbara Creasy, this week. She gave a media briefing, and she said that the real culprits are the developed world, because for 200 years they have been emitting all this carbon as part of since the Industrial Revolution. And so they really have a bigger responsibility that we in the developing world do.
Yeah, and it goes to She's not wrong. The minister is totally correct that the developed world has developed using these technologies, using these fossil fuels to get to where they are. But the problem is that the onus to act is not just for developed world countries. Everybody signed the Paris Agreement saying that they're going to do as much as they can in order to safeguard our existence on the planet. However, for us, we would then need some support. And she's correct about that. But South Africa is not one of those countries that are blameless, right? We've been using coal for years and years, not only to produce our own oil, but to run the power stations that our utility is running. So we've got even a much larger onus in Africa as well as in the world, because we're part of the top 15, the top 20. And in some cases, depending on which year you would choose, when we go back in the past, we were part of the top 10 of emitters. So we are in a very precarious position around who can we say is to blame.
And of course, our problem as South Africa has been that we have been blessed with an abundance of coal. And so prior to the impetus for climate changes, South Africa's economy and its energy needs were predicated on coal, even as you say, with Sasol producing petrol and oil from coal. And so you know, our economy is geared to use a lot of coal.
Yes, and then that's a dependency that we have, right? But we also have to consider that we are also blessed with other resources that we haven't actually tapped into. So we've got one of the best solar potential in the world, the best solar radiation, if I use the technical term, in the world, right? We've got one of the best wind speeds, including the wind areas in the world are closer to our coastline. So we've got other resources. Just as much as we have coal, we also have gold, we also have the platinum metal groups, but we also have like your winds and your solar, as well as the potential to use the offshore wind potential there.
Well, that's a good note to pause on. Makes us feel a little bit better. But I'm going to come back after the break and ask you what we're actually doing. We're talking to Happy Khambule. We'll be right back. And we're back talking about climate change, what South Africa needs to do, what the world is discussing in Glasgow this week. Happy Khambule, as I understand the effects of climate change in South Africa, there are, I suppose you could say, three main effects. We're getting increasing storms. We have the potential for higher sea levels. We have a potential for wildfires. What does that mean? I mean, that affects different parts of South Africa differently. How do you see it? Are we dealing with? I mean, are we dealing with the problem? Now, as I understand it, in Cape Town, the key problem is water security. In Johannesburg, the key problem is water security, but it doesn't have the problem the coastal cities have of a rising sea level. And on the East Coast, we have tropical storms affecting the KZN, KwaZulu-Natal area. And of course, all coastal areas have sea levels rising. And in Mpumalanga, for instance, and the Vaal Triangle, coal has polluted the atmosphere, so we have that problem as well. Is that a fair summary of where South Africa is?
Yes, that is a fair summary of where South Africa is, but I would add a couple other impacts that have become more prevalent as well. So the Karoo is increasing, right? There's this increasing desertification, which is really a big problem because the areas where we are growing are becoming less, where we are growing food are becoming less. So we're going to have a problem which is going to cascade, or rather is starting to cascade into the production of staple foods, which obviously has got a price implication as well as a famine consequence if we do not manage it well. And then the second one, which you pointed to, I think is a bit more sensitive, is around, at least let's say in the Transvaal area, that we have a problem of getting water where water is needed. So the availability of water is a problem. But then we also have a problem which is similar to the East Coast, which is of storms. But our storms would be obviously your hails and the intensity of flooding. Or the propensity and intensity of flooding. And that's where our infrastructure is starting to fall apart. So whilst at the sea level, by the coastlines, the sea level might be rising, and then we have to mitigate by building storm walls or moving people away from the shoreline. When they come inland, you've got desertification, so meaning that it's going to be hotter, more heat waves, less area to actually grow food. And then secondly is that when there is water, that water comes in a rush that destroys the infrastructure, meaning that there's other cascading social and economic implications that are going to be more prevalent.
And of course, we lost time because in the time when we needed to be improving our energy and making it more green using renewables and so on, using solar and wind, at exactly that time, Eskom became less efficient. It was using more and more coal, and in fact was less functional. So it makes it harder for the transition.
Yeah, and also started to depend a lot more on peaker plants, right? On diesel plants, which they want to turn as well into gas power plants. But we still have an opportunity to switch, because if we don't switch, we're going to be in a bigger problem, right? So we need to switch anyway. But we also need to build the ability for infrastructure and our systems to be resilient to the impacts that are prevailing and that are also coming up.
Now, the minister's argument, as I understood it, is that they are now tackling the problem significantly. That they are currently they don't have a full plan yet because they are mapping the whole country, but their focus is going to be on changing Eskom, on bringing in green hydrogen as a fuel, and that will rely to some extent on Sasol, because Sasol is an asset because it has technological and scientific resources and skills and history and expertise, and we're moving to electric vehicles. Are those the three main things South Africa hopes to do?
Yeah, I think for the first phase, that will be the main big projects that South Africa needs to do. But again, this is also just part of the, I don't want to say political system, but that's kind of the system that we currently have in South Africa, where a problem is really looked at a grand scale without considering the ground level impacts. So if you think about it, is that we're going to move to electric vehicles. That's great for air pollution. That's great for in terms of price sensitivity with oil. That's great because we are addressing our climate problems. We're going to move to green electricity. That's great for Eskom and all of that. And we're bringing hydrogen also for export. So our trade competitiveness becomes better. But that doesn't mean that at the residential level, we're going to be okay, right? That's where the second phase will be quite important, where we have to get the technologies, we have to get these initiatives adopted at a household level, where your house, any household has to have solar on it, has to have a solar water heater, has to have a JoJo tank or a rainwater harvesting tank in order to secure itself from the impacts that are going to be prevailing.
And also, doesn't it need, I mean, I lived in America where people focused on insulation because heating and cooling is so expensive. Isn't it possible already with our current technological state for South Africa to do much more to get residential and commercial buildings using renewables and doing insulation, which would stimulate the economy and create jobs and fix this problem?
Yeah, I think you're totally correct about that, because we tend to forget that we want to produce as much as possible without making sure that what we have is efficient, which energy efficiency really addresses. And I'm happy that you brought it up. The economy will be stimulated a lot more, and this is evidence that has been found in many of the discussions, as well as the literature that we're finding, is that if households and commerce is able to adopt these technologies, you're creating economies of scale, not only at a domestic level, but also that can be replicated outside of that particular local area, meaning that you can actually export not only in South Africa, but I mean, in the region as well. So we need those. So we need to insulate. We need to change the way in which households are able to use, keep and recycle their own types of power and water. And the best way to do that is to make mass adoption available. That means incentivizing new purchases and also allowing a version of dumping of the technologies at a local level.
Yeah, and we should be, I mean, we should have been natural providers and exporters of all of these things through Africa, which is the next great energy consumer in the world.
Yeah, that's correct. That's where most of the energy demand is going to increase for the next centuries, if not a couple of decades, and the most populous in terms of the population growth is going to be highest in Africa as well, since it is also the youngest. What I think is also missing is that the world was looking to South Africa to play a much bigger role in the value chain of renewables as well as energy efficiency. Because we knew this beforehand, we knew this in 1998. Yes. What we needed to do. It's just that we didn't know the scale in what we needed to do, but we already saw it in terms of our foresight as to what we need to do.
And we didn't really act, did we?
No, we didn't. I mean, we're still stuck in a situation where we've got solar water heaters stuck in warehouses in Eastern Cape, and the Department of Energy is not allowing them to be deployed in RDP houses and shared more widely in the market space.
Right. We're going to run out of time, Happy, and I really am really grateful for the time you've given us. But before I do, I wanted to just go back to the work you're doing on cities. What are the issues, or are they similar to what you've just been talking about?
Well, the cities one is more behavioral as well as taking stewardship of the environment. So what Clean Cities has been working largely on is to say, look, we have a natural environment and we've got a relationship with the local authorities, but really what we live in should be a reflection of how we see ourselves. So let's get the community out to take ownership of the local spaces. So it's kind of like cleanups and making sure that the areas that are there are actually more hygienic, more clean, and we can take pride in our local areas.
And I mean, I assume that's something that really should work with government, and government should be proactive at the local and provincial level.
Yeah, so before COVID-19 really hit, we got a lot of support from, at least in Johannesburg, some of the local government councils, but thereafter things just kind of changed. So we had to reach out to other forms of organizations and the private sector, but we're hoping that after the local government elections, things will get better, because the support really needs to come from government to support the communities, right? Because the communities are the ones who are taking ownership of the spaces and allowing service delivery to happen in a much more fluid manner, outside of just having to keep on doing the same thing all the time.
And national and community campaigns for things like insulation and mass renewable transition.
Yeah. So in other projects, that's what we're exactly working on, that we need to start unlocking the energy efficiency bottlenecks, meaning the standards that developers are building on, as well as how we're going to get these renewables into the households, on top of every roof, around the communities that need the energy so daily.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I want to wish you luck in Glasgow. I hope you'll come back and tell us what you achieved and what the next steps are. But good luck, and thanks for being on the forum.
Thank you for having me, and definitely I'll come back and give you the download, all of it.
Great, and we'll be right back. And we're back on the forum talking about climate change and the important conference going on in Glasgow, international conference trying to address this major crisis that the world is facing. My new guest is Thandile Chinyavanhu. Have I pronounced it correctly?
Yes, you have.
Thandile, very welcome. Thanks for joining us. You're a climate and energy campaigner at Greenpeace Africa. You have a Bachelor of Environmental and Health, and you're from the Nelson Mandela Metropolitan University. Welcome to the forum.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, on this program, we've just started talking about it. You wrote an article in the journal Agenda, and you were quite critical of South Africa's government's position.
Definitely. So the South African government has released their nationally determined contributions, and Greenpeace Africa was amongst the civil society organizations given the opportunity to make a submission on that. And we were quite vocal with them and implored them to put forward more ambitious targets for the upcoming COP26 negotiations.
Right. And what is the difference between your position and the government's position, precisely?
Well, Greenpeace Africa has produced some analysis with regards to what our nationally determined contributions should be looking like at this stage. And basically, we've called for the government to reduce our emissions range to an upper boundary of 288 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The government has proposed rather a weaker emissions profile, which sees us emitting between 350 metric tons of carbon dioxide at the lower boundary and an upper boundary of 420 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent annually. And this definitely is not ambitious enough. It's misaligned to what is required by the Paris Agreement, what is required by science, as well as what is considered a part of South Africa's fair share range.
Right. And one of the things you refer to as a particular problem is the gender implications of climate change.
Definitely, that's something that Greenpeace Africa remains vocal about, is the impact that climate change has on women. Because women are more vulnerable due to our ecological dependence, many women in rural areas are responsible for farming and being the breadwinners in their family through agriculture. This will definitely have an immediate impact on them as drought and floods begin to be more prominent and start to affect the yield crops. We'll start to see a lot more women put out by the impacts of climate change and forced to migrate as a result of food insecurity.
One of the other points you made, I think in your article, is that in fact climate change isn't just an academic problem in any other respect. It's going to kill people.
Definitely. And that's something that we're definitely seeing as reports begin to surface about the impacts of climate change and how it might begin to unfold before 2050, is that it's going to have drastic socioeconomic and political issues at the end of the day. So one of the things that was released by the World Meteorological Organization this past week is that the sub-Saharan African region could expect to see a decline in our gross domestic product of about 3% by 2050. And as we know, South Africa is at a deficit when it comes to preparing and mitigating climate change because of our financial constraints and our lack of financial robustness. So what we see is that our infrastructure begins to suffer as a result of the extreme weather events that we're seeing, such as flooding. Already the Johannesburg Road Agency a few years ago indicated that they're having major issues with infrastructure, and they need about between 8 to 20 million to actually repair the roads. So this is a great cost, but even greater than that is that flooding is actually contributing to a degradation in our infrastructure. So we're definitely going to see a lot of economic challenges going forward and a lot more people suffering at the hands of unemployment as a result of this economic decline that we're likely to see. And ultimately that will lead to food insecurity issues for many people.
Right. Now, this week, I listened to the Minister of Fisheries, Forestry and the Environment, Barbara Creecy, talking about government plans. It seems that they are behind, but they are trying to develop a mapping the total problem in the country, because it's different in Durban, in eThekwini and Cape Town and Johannesburg. We've raised some of these issues on the program already. But do you see, do you see the government, I mean, how do they catch up? Are they going to catch up?
Well, what we've seen so far is our government has done a good job in mapping what some of the issues are across the regions and putting out different reports with regards to the climate change plans. And that will be a critical issue as we go forward into implementing some of the mitigation and adaptation plans. But definitely there's a lot more work to be done on a policy level to ensure that this is actually enacted. So what is going to be happening or will be announced likely at the COP is South Africa's passing of the climate change bill, which will be a major policy document as far as legislating climate action, and that will include some sectoral emission targets, and that will really allow for the government to enforce carbon majors such as Eskom and Sasol to actually be compelled to reduce their emissions, because currently they are the largest emitters in South Africa and contributing gravely to climate change.
Now, in your article, you criticized the government for being slow in bringing this bill out. When do you think it'll actually get into Parliament and get passed?
So the bill was initially being held up at the stages with NEDLEC, but it's currently been positioned in front of Parliament, and it's likely to be passed as early as 2022, apologies,
2022.
yes.
Okay. Now, the big issue, of course, that people talk about is we know that we have been blessed and now cursed with having so much coal. So everything in South Africa's economy has been predicated on the use of coal, not only for electricity, but also for fuel through Sasol. What is the just transition seems to me obviously the key thing that has to happen, isn't it?
Definitely. We often hear our politicians citing that that our core resources need to be exploited, and that we're gifted with that, and it would be preposterous to not exploit that. But the thing about South Africa is that we're also blessed with the weather, which allows us to harness the power of the sun to actually generate electricity. And so renewable energies is a very important resource that we need to exploit. And South Africa has not even begun to tap into our renewable energy potential. But speaking to the point of a just transition, it's something that is definitely that needs to be implemented immediately and fast-tracked, as we're seeing the license of coal is waning throughout the world. Just recently, China has announced that they will no longer be financing coal projects abroad. So definitely there is a push for the world and even financial institutions to divest from coal. And South Africa, if we need to position ourselves for the way that the economy is going to look in future, particularly driven by green technology, we need to understand that by delaying this process any further, it's just going to leave all of the miners that are dependent on coal and all of the manufacturers in those industries in the lurch, and ultimately left in the lurch because they cannot be able to be absorbed into alternative industries.
Now, we need to take a break in about 90 seconds, but just briefly, can you just say what you mean by a just transition?
Well, a just transition is based on the fact that we are aware that gas and coal will no longer play as prominent roles because of climate issues. And we need to prepare for that transition that is imminent and ultimately will occur by preparing the public for this transition and ensuring that those, because South Africa has a high dependence on coal and many people employed by these industries, that they are adequately trained and given the opportunity to transfer into industries that can accommodate those great number of people. So for example, many carbon majors are proposing agriculture as a means of absorbing this great workforce. But unfortunately, their current operations are actually eroding the potential that the agricultural industry has. So long as we continue to pollute the environment and affect our climate, it's ultimately going to affect these other areas and industries that are working adjacent or
And agriculture, as I understand, is employing less people. It's getting more capital intensive and more mechanized, isn't it?
Definitely, because of the climate issues that we're starting to see, yields are getting lower. A lot more people are experiencing difficulty in agriculture. We're facing a lot more extreme weather events, just as that we saw earlier this year in parts of Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and our neighboring countries, Mozambique and Zimbabwe. When Cyclone Eloise hit, it definitely affected the crops in those areas, and it's definitely going to be a food security issue going forward.
Right. When we're going to take a break, but when we come back, I want to talk a bit more about the financing, but also about this whole question of the difficulty of a just transition. I believe in it very strongly, but I'm aware that it's not something that's particularly easy to do. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we'll have our final segment on Glasgow and climate change and how South Africa can play its part. And we're back talking about the Glasgow conference on climate change and South Africa's role, South Africa's policy, and how South Africa can play its part in making this massive, important, and difficult transition from coal to green energy. Thandile, the just transition is difficult, isn't it?
Definitely. There are a lot of, there's nuance to the issue, and there are a lot of challenges that we could possibly encounter. But it's a matter of providing the necessary research to ensure that we understand what a just transition will entail and how it could possibly impact labor.
Well, how does that work? I mean, we can see that the Minister of Mining and Energy, Gwede Mantashe, he seems to be resistant to this transition. He seems to favor some renewables, but he's been very strong on coal. And I suppose, I mean, one can criticize him for it, but I suppose part of the underlying reason is he comes from the mining sector, he knows coal miners, and he sees that coal miners might lose their jobs.
Definitely, and we understand that as Greenpeace Africa, that South Africa as a coal-dependent country, where 80% of our energy mix is derived from coal, that it is a daunting prospect, but it's something that South Africa needs to prepare for nonetheless, as it is imminent.
So it all depends on the preparation. And what does that mean?
Well, first of all, what we need to see is a greater uptake of renewable energy to diversify our energy mix. So speaking from a perspective of climate action and how that could possibly reduce our emissions in the long term, the integrated resource plan that was put out in 2019 proposed renewable energy components. And these are actually the strongest in terms of emission reduction capacity, as opposed to all the mitigation that have been proposed. So Greenpeace Africa's analysis revealed that the renewable energy components of the IRP could actually pose to reduce South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions by 84 metric tons of carbon dioxide a year. And that's a massive amount compared to what we are putting out currently.
But tell me more about the justice in our just transition. I mean, I completely buy your argument about the need to go to renewables, but what is it going to mean for people in Mpumalanga, in the Vaal Triangle? What does it mean for jobs?
Well, there are multiple research that has been put out. Greenpeace Africa itself has also put out 2 different pieces of research with regards to a just transition and the benefits of it. And this focuses on case studies across Germany, South Korea, as well as Indonesia, countries that are known for their status as being coal-dependent countries, and mechanisms that they've deployed to ensure that they can actually move away from that dependence on coal. And many organizations are putting out research with regards to renewable energy, particularly Renewable Energy 21, as well as IRENA. And they're actually finding that renewable energy, because of its ability to quickly be taken up into the system and its cost effectiveness, that it's actually one of the greatest mechanisms to create job creation. So Greenpeace Africa also put out a piece in Business Live a few months ago about the possibility that renewable energy has in creating job creation in South Africa right now, as opposed to our government looking at measures like powership, as well as coal power stations, nuclear power stations that would take a long amount of time and require a lot of investment. Renewable energy could actually allow us to deploy energy quicker and fix our energy situation, while also creating jobs for people.
I accept that. Does it mean that will all the coal miners in the coal fields in Mpumalanga, in the Vaal Triangle, will all of them be absorbed into renewable energy jobs?
Definitely not. There is a scale to which the research has revealed the amount of jobs that can be created. I think in Sub-Saharan Africa, they've already been able to deploy 600,000 people into work. But of course, there are other sectors that could possibly accommodate this great workforce, as I mentioned, in agriculture and manufacturing. And that's one of the great benefits about renewable energy, is that there is a great amount of employment that you could possibly find for people throughout the supply chain. So if South Africa can focus on using the minerals that we have to beneficiate them and actually create a manufacturing environment in which we can produce our own renewable energy, solar panels, as well as wind turbines, then there could definitely be a greater uptake of jobs within those manufacturing sectors.
And we should be exporting into Africa. So actually, really, that's an absolute necessity. We can't simply make a slow, weak transition. We need to aggressively take on this sector in such a way that we become a leader instead of an also-ran.
Definitely, and South Africa has that capacity and that potential to lead the climate in terms of lead the continent in terms of climate action. But we're actually lagging behind in terms of our commitments to climate change mitigation, as well as our renewable energy potential. Kenya is actually leading in terms of renewable energy and work, and they're also leading in terms of climate action.
So we're well behind Kenya.
Well behind.
Yeah. Now, government's policy seems to focus on Eskom, green energy for aviation fuels and so on, through green hydrogen and electric vehicles, and they hope to use Sasol's technological expertise to help them. Does that plan make sense to you?
The challenge with this is that we're not giving enough room for renewable energy, which poses great potential for job creation in the immediate and opportunity. As I mentioned, we haven't even begun to tap our renewable energy potential. And we've definitely seen Sasol speaking and marketing their green hydrogen, and that could potentially be a good source of low carbon fuels, aviation fuels, and especially in shipping. So it's definitely within those niche categories would be able to provide a decarbonization potential. But we should not put our eggs all in one basket, and that being green hydrogen. There's a great dependence on that. And currently, green hydrogen remains prohibitively expensive and would not be able to be produced economically or even at scale for what South Africa's energy needs are right now.
I mean, just looking at the broader economic developmental progress that South Africa needs, the days of what, Asia's amazing growth and job creation, those ways of doing it are no longer available to us. We have to get multiple sectors right, because none of them is a silver bullet, isn't that so?
Definitely.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the political parties. They're all they're all campaigning, and the elections are tomorrow. But I looked at the Daily Mail's assessment, and they found all the parties fairly weak on climate change. They had some vague ideas about it, but not a lot of specificity.
Definitely, and that's something that our political parties could stand to improve on. The youth, especially if they want to win the vote of the youth, we're definitely seeing a lot more youth getting actively involved in climate action, and it's because they have an understanding that it impacts them directly. So our government organizations are not doing enough to actually advocate for greater ambition. And that might be largely in part to the fact that there is no political will, and there's a greater alignment of our politicians with the carbon majors such as Sasol and Eskom to really actually challenge them on their emissions and ensure that they reduce their emissions. So there's definitely their commitments lie with the carbon majors right now.
Now, one of the issues appears to be, although it hasn't been stated that much, that the renewable energy sector is less black empowered. Is that a factor, and is it something that can be corrected?
Definitely, there are measures to correct it. And one of the issues that are in discussion with Labour right now is ensuring that there is an equitable share into the renewable energy. So socially owned renewable energy projects that people can benefit from directly, unlike what we've seen with the fossil fuel and extractive industry, where it's mainly benefited a very small sector of society.
So what's missing? Why isn't that happening?
Those discussions are in place, and definitely it is a policy issue, but we're also seeing there have been mechanisms that have been praised that the South African government has deployed to actually ensure that there is a great and equitable access to renewable energy and ownership of that socially owned renewable energies. So South Africa has actually pioneered in that sense of ensuring that we have a socially owned renewable energy sector.
Right. In the last few minute and a half that we have, I saw that the government is putting a lot of emphasis on setting up financing mechanisms, and in Glasgow we'll be talking to foreign governments, hoping to get them to help fund the energy transition. Do you see hope in that?
Definitely. So the Global North has committed to deploy concessional funding to the value of about 100 billion. And so that is something that's going to be...
Is that 100 billion US dollars?
Yes, 100 billion US dollars. And
right.
That's something that will be of great discussion topic at the COP, as this commitment was made around 2013, and we definitely want to see a lot more deployment of this financing. So there's been a lot of talk from the US to try and substantiate where this money has gone, whether it has been deployed or not. And there have been a lot of discussions about the possibility of climate debt swaps to ensure that countries are able to meet some of the climate commitments, and in exchange for that have some debt relief from the debt that they are currently owing. And so Eskom is also negotiating this and trying to advocate for some of their debt relief through committing to reduce and transition to climate change. But definitely this must have conditions. We want to see that this is actually ensures that tangible changes are witnessed before this is...
That it goes to green energy. Yeah, exactly, because obviously it could be a saving grace for Eskom for the problems that predate the whole issue of the energy transition. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. Thandile, thank you so much for talking to us. We really enjoyed it. I hope we'll see you again soon. To our viewers, we hope you all go and vote for whoever you vote for tomorrow, and we see you next week on the forum.